Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's stream on the Five Good Emperors, reflections on the Nerva-Antonine Dynasty. I've been meaning to get back to a classical sort of Roman history for quite a while, and it's a great opportunity to do so because this is a topic I've been thinking about covering for quite a long time because I think it's something that I think needs a bit of a reappraisal, and I think I've got some interesting points and takes to share with people watching tonight. There was a comment before I went live by Wrongtail Woo. Alright, I've got work to do still, but wish you the best streaming beat. The mission did nothing wrong. Yes, I agree. The mission did nothing wrong, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to cover this, because I think the Five Good Emperors are sort of coast off the sort of damnatio in memoriam that Domitian suffered after he was assassinated, and very much contrasted as a sort of enlightened peak of Roman civilization after this quote unquote Flavian tyranny. And one day I would like to do a stream actually reappraising Domitian's legacy. And so just for those who don't know, so who are the Five Good Emperors? Well, this is a term referring, broadly speaking, to five emperors from what's called the Nerva-Antonine Dynasty, which was a period that lasted from 96 BC, from the assassination of Domitian, all the way up until I believe it's 195 AD, when Commodus is murdered and deposed, the son of Marcus Aurelius. And the Five Good Emperors refer to Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. And of course, there's Commodus, but obviously he's not counted for being a bit of a disaster. And then there's, of course, the lesser-known Lucius Verus, who was Marcus Aurelius's adoptive brother and co-emperor. And so where does this actual term Five Good Emperors come from? Well, it actually comes from Machiavelli in his Discourses on Livy, which is the other major work of his other than The Prince. And the Discourses on Livy is Machiavelli's sort of commentary on the Roman historian Livy's sort of Ab Urbe Condita, the history of the city of Rome, and other sort of broader observations of Roman history. And it's taken from chapter 10 of the Discourses on Livy, which I just will start us off by giving a bit of a read. So, Chapter 10, that in proportion as the founder of a kingdom or commonwealth merits praise, he who founds a tyranny deserves blame. Of all who are praised, they are praised the most, who are the authors and founders of religions. After him come the founders of kingdoms and commonwealths. Next to these, they have the greatest name, who as commanders of armies have added to their own dominions of those of their country. After these again are ranked men of letters, who being of various shades of merit, are celebrated each in his degree. To all others, whose number is infinite, is ascribed that measure of praise to which his profession or occupation entitles him. And conversely, all who contribute to the overthrow of religion or to the ruin of kingdoms and commonwealths, all who are foes to letters and to the arts which confer honour and benefit of the human race, are held in infamy and detestation. No one, whether he be wise or foolish, bad or good, if asked to choose between those two kinds of men, will ever be found to withhold praise from what deserves praise, or blame from what is to be blamed, and yet almost all, deceived by a false good and a false glory, allow themselves either ignorantly or wilfully to follow in the footsteps such as deserve blame rather than praise, or blame from what is to be blamed, and yet almost all, deceived by false good and a false glory, allow themselves either ignorantly or willfully to follow in the footsteps such as deserve blame rather than praise, and to have it in their power to establish to a lasting renown a commonwealth or kingdom, turn aside to greater tyranny, rather thought how much they thereby lose in name, fame, security, tranquility, and peace of mind, and in name how much infamy, scorn, danger, and disquiet they are. But were they to read history and to turn to profit the lessons of the past, it seems impossible that those living in a republic as private citizens should not prefer their native city to play the part of Scipio rather than of Caesar, or that those who by good fortune or merit have risen to be rulers should not seek rather to resemble Agesilaus, Timoleon, and Dion than to Nabis, Phalaris, and Dionysius, since they would see how the latter are loaded with infamy while the former have been extolled by bounds. They would see too how Timoleon and others like him had as great authority in their country as Dionysius or Phalaris in theirs, but during far greater security, nor let anyone finding Caesar celebrated by a crowd of writers be misled by his glory, for those who praise him have been corrupted by good fortune, and overawed by the greatness of that empire which, being governed in his name, would not suffer any to speak their minds openly concerning him. But let him who desires to know how historians would have written of Caesar, had they been free to declare their thoughts, mark what they say of Catiline, than whom Caesar is more hateful, in proportion as he who does is more to be condemned than he who only desires to do evil. Let them see also what praises they lavish upon Brutus, because being unable, out of respect for his power, to approach Caesar, they magnify his enemy. And if he who has become prince in any state will but reflect, how after Rome was made an empire, far greater praise was earned those emperors who lived within the laws and worthily than by those who lived in the country way. He will see that Titus, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus, and Marcus had no need of praetorian cohorts, of countless legions to guard them, but were defended by their own good lives, the goodwill of their subjects, and the attachment of the Senate. In like manner, he will perceive in the case of Caligula, Nero, Vitellius, and ever so many more of those evil emperors, that all the armies of the east and of the west were of no avail to protect them from the enemies whom their bad and depraved lives raised up against them. And were the history of these emperors rightly studied, it would be a sufficient lesson to any prince how to distinguish the paths which led to honour and safety from those which end in shame and insecurity. For the 26 emperors from Caesar to Maximius, 16 came to a violent, 10 only to a natural death, and only one or two of those who died by violence may have been good princes, as Galba or Pertinax, and met their fate in consequence of that corruption which their predecessors had left behind in the army. And if among those who died a natural death there be found some bad emperors like Severus, it is to be ascribed to their signal good fortune and to their great abilities, advantages seldom found united in the same man. From the study of this history, we may also learn how a good government is to be established. For while all the emperors who succeeded to the throne by birth except Titus were bad, all were good who succeeded by adoption, as in the case of the 5 from Nerva to Marcus. But so soon as the empire fell once more to the heirs by birth, its ruin recommenced. Now the prince therefore looked at that period which extends from Nerva to Marcus and contrast it with that which went before and that which came after, and then let him say in which of them he would wish to have been born or to have been reigned. For those during these times in which good men governed, he will see the prince secure in the midst of happy subjects, and the whole world filled with peace and justice. He will find the Senate maintaining its authority, the magistrates enjoying their honours, the rich citizens their wealth, rank, and merit held in respect, ease, and content everywhere prevailing, rancor, license, corruption, ambition everywhere quenched, and that golden age restored in which everyone might hold and support what opinions he pleased. He will see, in short, the world triumphing, the sovereign honoured and revered, the people animated with love and rejoicing in their security. But should he turn to examine the times of the other emperors, he will find them wasted by battles, torn by seditions, cruel alike in war and peace, many princes perishing by the sword, many wars foreign and domestic, if the overwhelmed with unheard of disasters, had towns destroyed and plundered, Rome burned, the capital razed to the ground by Roman citizens, the ancient temples desolated, the ceremonies of religion corrupted, the cities ranked with adultery, the seas covered with exiles and the islands polluted with blood. He will see outrage follow outrage, rank, riches, honours, and above all, virtue imputed as mortal crimes, informers rewarded, slaves bribed to betray their masters, freedmen their patrons, and those who were without enemies brought to destruction by their friends. And then he will know the true nature of the debt which Rome, Italy, and the world owe to Caesar. And if he possesses a spark of human feeling, will turn from the example of those evil times and kindle with a consuming passion to imitate those who were good. And in truth, the prince who seeks for worldly glory should desire to be the ruler of a corrupt city, not that, like Caesar, he may destroy it, but that, like Romulus, he may restore it, since man cannot hope for nor heaven offer any better opportunity of fame, were it indeed necessary in giving a constitution to a state to forfeit its sovereignty. The prince who, to retain his station, should withhold a constitution, might plead excuse, but for him, who in giving a constitution can still retain his sovereignty, no excuse is to be made, that those therefore to whom heaven has afforded his opportunity, remember that 2 courses lie open to them, one which will render them secure while they live and glorious when they die, another which exposes them to continual difficulties in life and condemns them to eternal infamy after death. So what Machiavelli is really saying there is that because the 5 good emperors, quote unquote, they were not the biological sons of their predecessors. They were very much adopted legally by their predecessors. So, Nerva adopted Trajan, Trajan adopted Hadrian, et cetera, et cetera. And so this led to a more, meritocratic succession where the empire was handed over to somebody of good character or virtue, as Machiavelli would call it. And he very much argues that this idea of a emperor handing off the empire to a biological son or heir is always going to be disastrous, because you can't guarantee the quality of the monarch. And there is some truth in that, but again, I think he's putting a little bit too much in this practice of adoption, because what's important to understand is that the five good emperors were not adopted because consciously the rulers were looking to find a good heir. It was more because the practice of adoption in ancient Rome was a legal precedent to ensure the paterfamilias, or the father of the household, would always provide a male heir to carry on the domestic ancestor cult and preside over the hearth, and attend to the family ghosts and spirits. And that also extends to the government of the country or the empire as a whole. And so therefore, in a way, the Nerva-Antonine dynasty is very much a very uniquely Roman dynasty, in that it used this very unique method of sort of legal succession, if you like, through adoption. And they're not. It's important to note that they weren't the first dynasty to do this, because the Julio-Claudians, who were the first Roman dynasty, the ones founded by Augustus. The only difference is that the Julio-Claudians are very much the intermarriage between two patrician houses, the Julii and the Claudii, with the latter emperors, sort of Caligula and Nero, being able to actually claim blood descent from both sides of the dynasty. And it's important to note is that in the Julio-Claudians, that the throne wasn't just passed from father to son. It was always to remember the dynasty, but to bolster the claim of their chosen heir, the governing emperor would always adopt who they wanted. So, for example, Augustus had numerous heirs. So, because he had no son of his own, he had his daughter Julia. So, Julia has 3 sons with Marcus Agrippa, so Gaius, Lucius, and Postumus Agrippa, who Augustus adopts in turn to be his heirs. The former 2 dying, and the latter one being exiled due to some claims licentious behaviour. And he ends up later adopting his stepson Tiberius to succeed him, and Tiberius would later, because his own son Castor would predecease him, would adopt his grandnephew Caligula. Obviously, Caligula doesn't adopt Claudius because he had no intention of being succeeded, but when he's assassinated, the Praetorian Guard claimed Claudius as Caesar, according to Suetonius anyway. But of course, later Claudius does adopt Nero, his son-in-law. And what's actually interesting is the dynasty that comes in between the Flavian dynasties. The Flavians are more like a contemporary dynasty, as in it's the father Vespasian being followed by his 2 sons, Titus and Domitian. But then what's interesting is after we have the 5 good emperors and the Nerva-Antonines, what do we have? We then return to another traditional dynasty in the Severans, where again we have the founder Septimius Severus, who's then followed by his sons Caracalla and Geta, and then the other members, I think cousins or grandnephews, Elagabalus and Severus Alexander. So Rome always seems to sort of vary in the nature of their dynasties, but it's interesting that ultimately there was a long-standing practice going back to the ancient kingdom, republic, and even to the Julio-Claudians of adoption, providing that necessary kind of a divine and legal sort of claim and legitimacy to a chosen successor. And just to sort of buttress that, there's another reading I want to do. This is from Fustel de Coulanges, The Ancient City. Just going to bring that up one moment. Right. Chapter 4, Adoption and Emancipation. The duty of perpetuating the domestic worship was the foundation of the law of adoption among the ancients. The same religion which obliged a man to marry, which pronounced a divorce in case of sterility, which in case of impotence or premature death substituted a relative in place of the husband, still offered to a family one final resource to escape the so much dreaded misfortune of extinction. This resource was the right of adoption. He whom nature has denied a son can adopt one, so that the funeral ceremonies may not cease. Thus speaks the old legislator of the Hindus. We have a curious plea of an Athenian orator in a case where the legitimacy of a son's adoption was contested. And just to clarify, where he's mentioning Hindus there, in the ancient city, Coulange is leaning upon three different sort of ancient pagan city-state traditions, namely Rome, Greece, namely Athens, and sort of ancient India, although he's largely focusing on the two classical examples and lesser India, but they will come up on occasion. The defendant shows us first the motive for which one adopted a son. Menocles, it says, did not wish to die without children. He was desirous of leaving behind him someone to bury him, and after time to perform the ceremonies of the funeral worship. He then goes on to show what will happen if the tribunal annuls his adoption, what will happen not only to himself but to the one who has adopted him. Menocles is dead, and still it is in the interest of Menocles that it is at stake. If you annul my adoption, you will leave Menocles, who is dead, without a son, and consequently no one will perform the sacrifices in his honour, no one will offer him the funeral repast, and thus he will be without worship. To adopt a son was then to watch over the perpetuity of the domestic religion, the safety of the sacred fire, the continuation of the funeral offerings, and the repose of the manes of the ancestors. There being no reason for adoption except the necessity of preventing the extinction of a worship, it was permitted only to one who had no son. The law of the Hindus is formal on this point. That of the Athenians is not less so. All the orations of Demosthenes against the Arcuries are proof of this. No particular passage proves that this was the case in the old Roman law, and we know that in the time of Gaius, a man might have had the same time sons by nature and sons by adoption. Indeed, I mentioned Claudius, and Claudius had a biological son with his third wife, Messalina, called Britannicus, and that actually resulted in a bit of a succession struggle when Claudius dies, because though he'd fallen out with Britannicus, he started warming to him towards the end of his life, and it's claimed by people such as Suetonius that Nero and his mother schemed to murder Claudius, and then they murdered Britannicus to ensure a smooth succession for Nero. It appears, however, that this point was not admitted as legal in Cicero's time. From one of his orations, the orator expresses himself thus: what is the law concerning adoption? Why, that he may adopt children who is no longer able to have children himself, and who failed of having them what he was of an age to expect it. To adopt is to seek by regular and sacerdotal law that which by the ordinary process of nature he is no longer able to obtain. Cicero attacks the adoption of Clodius, taking the ground that the man who has adopted him already has a son, and he declares that this adoption is contrary to sacerdotal law. When a son was adopted, it was necessary first all that he should be initiated into a form of worship, introduced into a domestic religion, brought into the presence of the new Penates. Adoption, therefore, was accompanied by ceremony, very much like that which took place at the birth of a son. In this way, the newcomer was admitted to the hearth, associated in the new religion. God's sacred objects, rites, prayers, all became common between him and his adopted father. They said of him in Sacro Transit, he is passed to the worship of the new family. By this very ceremony, he renounced the worship of the old one. We have seen, indeed, that according to this ancient belief, the same man could not sacrifice at two halves, or honour two series of ancestors. Admitted to a new house, the old became foreign to him. He no longer had anything in common with the hearth near which he was born, and could no longer offer the funeral repast to his own ancestors. The ties of birth were broken, the new tie of common worship took the ascendancy. The man became so completely a stranger to his own family that if he happened to die, his natural father had no right to take charge of the funeral or to conduct the procession. The adopted son could not return again to the old family, or at most the law permitted this only when, having a son, he left that son to take his place in the adopted family. They considered that the perpetuity of the family being thus assured, he might leave it, but in this case he severed all ties that bound him to his own son. Emancipation corresponded as a correlative to adoption. In order that a son might enter a new family, it was necessary that he should be able to leave the old, that is to say, that he should be emancipated from its religion. The principal effect of emancipation was the renunciation of the worship of the family to which one was born. The Romans designated this act by the very significant name of sacrorum detestatio, renunciation of the rites. So it's interesting, not only could a man adopt a son into his family, you could also emancipate an adopted son, or even emancipate your own biological son. And indeed, to give an example of this, there's the famous general Aemilius Paulus, who was very famous for winning the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC and enabled the conquest of Macedon and completing the conquest of Greece by the Romans. And he, interestingly, had two sons from his first marriage before he divorced his then wife. He would later remarry and produce two further sons. And due to the cost of having to maintain a large household, he decided to emancipate his two elder sons, who were both adopted into two other noble patrician families that were lacking heirs, namely the Fabii of the Fabius Maximus, Fabius the Delayer of the Second Punic War fame, and also with the Cornelii, the family of Scipio Africanus. In fact, it was Africanus's son who adopted the other son of Aemilius Paulus, who is better known to history as Scipio Africanus the Younger, or Scipio Aemilianus, the conqueror of Carthage. So you can see there's this sort of long history of this practice of emancipation and adoption of the various sort of Roman elites, sort of emancipating and adopting each other's sons to carry on their bloodlines. And so when you look at the five good emperors, you can almost see that the emperor is sort of hunting around, trying to find a worthy heir or successor from the elite, and then once they find one suitable, they adopt them, which is completely legal. And again, just to link into this idea of honoring the dead, what would each of the five good emperors do when they took power? They would always honor their father by having them deified. And one other point on emancipation is one of the criticisms about Marcus Aurelius is obviously that he was succeeded by his biological son Commodus. And there's very much this idea shared in films like Gladiator that, Marcus Aurelius wanted to restore the Republic, and essentially, it would have been right for him to have done this, to disinherit Commodus, because he was so unfit for power. And I think this is cope, frankly, because I think the idea of a father disinheriting his own son to not succeed him, I just think is so anathema. Like, it would only been done for like very, very good reasons. And it's important to understand is, why did all the other of the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, the five good emperors, why did they end up adopting someone? And it's because none of them, by the time they were nearing the end of their life, had a living biological male heir. So there was a necessity in adoption. Comment from Infernal Morants. Are you telling me Russell Crowe lied? Well, I would say more Ridley Scott lied, Infernal Morants. And so ultimately, what was Marcus Aurelius supposed to do? I mean, technically, he could have emancipated Commodus and then, I don't know, adopted someone else, but I don't think there's any precedent of that ever in Roman history, especially as Commodus was his only living male son. I could understand it if Marcus Aurelius produced more than one biological son, but again, that's always going to leave a problem if he had done so. Or let's say he does a Claudius, where he adopts someone like I was going to say like a Nero, but as in he finds someone who's better qualified, adopts them in spite of having Commodus as his biological son, and then I don't know, maybe makes them rule jointly or emancipates Commodus. But again, I think you'll get a Nero situation where Commodus would always aspire to the throne because his father held it, and probably scheme to murder the chosen successor anyway. So, and I think it's really important to understand this context, because what else was Marcus Aurelius supposed to do? It was a bit of a Gordian knot of a situation, and I suppose you could say it was kind of an accident of history that the other five good emperors did not have living male heirs, and so this fortunately allowed them to adopt somebody who was going to be capable with minimal skullduggery involved in the succession, with the one exception of Nerva, because Nerva comes in after Domitian is assassinated, the Senate declares Nerva emperor. Nerva had obviously been the long-serving senator and an advisor to the Flavians, and so ultimately he was. I've seen arguments that this was an attempt by the Senate to essentially lock down the Principate, the emperorship, by themselves, to ensure it operated in their interests. And I mean, I see some merit in that argument, but what ends up happening with Nerva is that because he's elderly and he's frequently unwell, he's pressured into a mutiny by the army, who Domitian was very popular with, to adopt Trajan, another officer who was popular with the army, as a successor, as a kind of compromise. And then, of course, with Trajan's own succession, Trajan there's a lot of debate on this, particularly Cassius Dio claims that. So Hadrian, who succeeded Trajan, he did have a link. He was married to Trajan's niece, and he also was serving in command of an army and actually the governor of Syria during the Parthian War that Trajan was prosecuting where Rome conquered Armenia and Mesopotamia. And there's a claim by Cassius Dio that Trajan's wife Platina was very fond of Hadrian, and that there was a scheme going on behind the scenes where when Trajan died, his death wasn't announced for several days, and when it is announced, it's revealed, oh, he adopted Hadrian on his deathbed. So that there's a little bit of skepticism around how genuine that adoption and succession was, and I guess we may never know. But when we look at when we come to Hadrian's own handling of the succession, Hadrian, when he's nearing the end of his life, he had actually found someone he thought was a suitable heir, namely a fellow called Lucius Aelius Caesar. But Aelius Caesar dies in 138, so just before Hadrian does. And so Hadrian then decides to adopt Aelius Caesar's own son, later known as Lucius Verus. And then he also adopts the grandson of a senator friend of his, the son later known as Marcus Aurelius. However, with Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius being very young, I think they were only teenagers at the time, he doesn't want to hand over control of the empire to those who are so young and inexperienced. And so he finds a seasoned political figure of his, Antoninus, and says, I will adopt you as emperor, provided you adopt Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus as your own sons and heirs to succeed you. And this leads to a very, I think, probably one of the most tranquil and peaceful, stable parts of the Roman Empire. And I think this was actually a very long-sighted policy of Hadrian's to not only secure the next generation, but the generation afterwards as well. And of course, yes, there would be there was some barbarian raids over the into Roman territory, but again, there's no major civil wars or other disruptions other than a revolt by a fellow called Cassius, the governor of Syria. And there's another comment from Richard Phillips. Yes, I've heard from other people saying that adoption frequently worked out better because they actually had a choice and could avoid bad eggs. Yes, there's certainly a logic to that, Richard Phillips. But as I've said, I think what people have to understand is that, in a way, it was quite fortunate that most of the five good emperors did not have biological sons, because the adoption provided a way to legally acquire an heir in a stable manner. So in a way, it was a very unique Roman solution to the problem. And so from there, what I would actually like to do is move on to Edward Gibbon, because Edward Gibbon, I think, is really responsible for the very positive reputation the five good emperors received, because in his volume 1 of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Gibbon starts by looking at the reign of what he calls the Antonines emperors as being sort of the peak of Roman prosperity and civilization, the peak of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And he very much then presents that with the death of Marcus Aurelius, the rest of the 8 volumes of Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire are like a chronicle of perpetual decline and fall of this once grandiose empire. So again, he's very much presenting it as a kind of imperial peak. So yeah, I just want to do a little bit of a reading from Gibbon. Right. In the 2nd century of the Christian era, the Empire of Rome comprehended the fairest part of the earth and the most civilized portion of mankind. The frontiers of that extensive monarchy were guarded by ancient renown and disciplined valor. The gentle but powerful influence of laws and manners had gradually cemented the union of the provinces. Their peaceful inhabitants enjoyed and abused the advantages of wealth and luxury. The image of a free constitution was preserved with decent reverence. The Roman Senate appeared to possess the sovereign authority and devolved on the emperors all the executive powers of government. During a happy period, AD 98 to 180, of more than 80 years, the public administration was conducted by the virtue and abilities of Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and the 2 Antonines, meaning Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius. It is the design of this and of the two succeeding chapters to describe the prosperous condition of their empire and the afterwards from the death of Marcus Antoninus, that being Marcus Aurelius, to deduce the most important circumstances of its decline and fall, a revolution which will ever be remembered and it's still felt by the nations of the earth. That essentially the the Western Christian world has never recovered from the death of Marcus Aurelius and the demise of the Antonine emperors. And again, that's the very first paragraph of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And something that's important to remember with Gibbon is that he's writing in the 18th century. So there's very much this kind of undercurrent of the kind of the Age of Enlightenment to what he's sort of outscoring here. He sees the Antonines as a kind of this is a little bit anachronistic to use this term, but in a way a kind of Roman like enlightened absolutism. So Gibbon was writing during the 1770s and 1780s. So I have to wonder if he was thinking of people like Frederick the Great of Prussia or Catherine the Great in Russia or Joseph II of the Habsburg monarchy. Though it should be noted that the term enlightened absolutism wouldn't be coined until the 19th century by Wilhelm Roscher. Though I still think the precedent still stands. And sort to serve some of the more observances made by Gibbon. So Gibbon then sort of surmised the general pattern of a Roman expansion from Augustus, with him consolidating Rome's frontiers, filling in all the gaps in places like the Rhine frontier, in Spain, in the Danube, and places such as Raetia and now Austria. And however, he's very condemnatory of emperors like Claudius and Domitian for the conquest of Britain, because he sees this as a waste of resources. And I actually do agree with Gibbon. I do think expanding into Britain was an overextension. There wasn't really much of value there. However, I do think it is a bit two-faced because Gibbon then goes on to praise Trajan's wars, the conquest of Dacia and of the provinces of Parthia, Mesopotamia, and Armenia. And I'm thinking, well, those campaigns were very expensive and also overextended, because what happens when Trajan dies? The first thing Hadrian does is he relinquishes Mesopotamia and Armenia because he realizes the frontiers have become overextended. And later on, about 100 years after the death of Marcus Aurelius, after the end of the crisis of the 3rd century, Dacia is abandoned because, again, they realize it's an overextension, and retreating back to the Danube as a natural frontier makes a lot more sense. And what does Hadrian also do to shore up the defenses and frontiers? He constructs Hadrian's Wall in Britain to better consolidate that extension. Coming from Richard Hughes, Gibbon's prose is excellent. Yeah, though, that is one strength of Gibbon. I think he's very pithy, very witty, and very eloquent. So I certainly can't take that away from him. And in terms of the frontiers, of course, when we get to Antoninus Pius, the Romans had pushed ahead to roughly where Scotland's central belt was, and under Antoninus Pius built the Antonine Wall, which they were very wise to abandon because, there was absolutely no worth clinging on to that, and the southern wall, Hadrian's Wall, was much more defensible. And Gibbon is especially praiseworthy Hadrian and Antoninus Pius for maintaining peace, and it's just especially very praiseworthy of their religious policy. But again, I think he starts bleeding too much Enlightenment ideas into ancient Rome. So there's another reading I want to do from Gibbon. Right. Okay. The policy of the emperors and the Senate, as far as concerned religion, was happily seconded by the reflections of the enlightened and by the habits of the superstitious part of their subjects. The various modes of worship which prevailed in the Roman world were all considered by the people as equally true, by the philosopher as equally false, and by the magistrate as equally useful, and thus toleration produced not only mutual indulgence but even religious concord. The superstition of the people was not embittered by any mixture of theological rancour, nor was it confined by the chains of any speculative system. The devout polytheist, though fondly attached to his national rites, admitted with implicit faith the different religions of the earth. Fear, gratitude, and curiosity, a dream or an omen, a singular disorder, or a distant journey, perpetually disposed him to multiply the articles of his belief and to enlarge the list of his protectors. The thin texture of the pagan mythology was interwoven with various but not discordant materials. As soon as it was allowed, the sages and heroes who had lived or had died for the benefit of their country were exalted to a state of power and immortality. It was universally confessed that they deserved, if not the adoration, at least the reverence of all mankind. The deities of a thousand groves and a thousand streams possessed in peace their local and respective influence, nor could the Roman who depreciated the wrath of the Tiber deride the Egyptian who presented his offering to the beneficent genius of the Nile. The visible powers of nature, the planets, and the elements were the same throughout the universe. The invisible governors of the moral world were inevitably cast in a similar mould of fiction and allegory. Every virtue and even vice acquired its divine representative, every art and profession its patron, whose attributes in the most distant ages and countries were uniformly derived from the character of their peculiar votaries. A republic of gods of such opposite tempers and interests required, in every system, the moderating hand of a supreme magistrate, who by the progress of knowledge and flattery was gradually invested with the sublime perfection of an eternal parent and an omnipotent monarch. Such was the mild spirit of antiquity, that the nations were less attentive to the difference than to the resemblance of their religious worship. The Greek, the Roman, and the barbarian, as they met before their respective altars, easily persuaded themselves that under various names, with various ceremonies, they adored the same deities. The elegant mythology of Homer gave a beautiful and almost regular form to the polytheism of the ancient world. The philosophers of Greece deduced their morals from the nature of man rather than from that of God. They mediated, however, on the divine nature as a very curious and important speculation, and in their profound inquiry they displayed the strength and weakness of the human understanding. Of the four most celebrated schools, the Stoics and the Platonists endeavoured to reconcile the jarring interests of reason and piety. They have left us the most sublime proofs of the existence and perfections of the first cause, but as it was impossible for them to conceive the creation of matter, the workman in the Stoic philosophy was not sufficiently distinguished from the work, whilst on the contrary, the spiritual god of Plato and his disciples resembled an idea rather than a substance. The opinions of the academics and Epicureans were of a less religious cast, but while the modest science of the former induced them to doubt, the positive ignorance of the latter urged them to deny the providence of a supreme ruler. The spirit of inquiry, prompted by emulation and supported by freedom, had divided the public teachers of philosophy into a variety of contending sects, but the ingenious youth who, from every part, resorted to Athens and the other seats of learning in the Roman Empire, were alike instructed in every school to reject and despise the religion of the multitude. How indeed was it possible then that a philosopher should accept as divine truths the idle tales of the poets and the incoherent traditions of antiquity, or that he should adore as gods those imperfect beings whom he must have despised as men? Against such unworthy adversaries, Cicero condescended to employ the arms of reason and eloquence, but the satire of Lucian was as much more adequate as well as more efficacious weapon. We may well be assured that a writer conversant with the world would never have ventured to expose the gods of his country to public ridicule, had they not already been the objects of secret contempt among the polished and enlightened orders of society. Notwithstanding the fashionable irreligion which prevailed in the age of the Antonines, both the interests of the priests and the credulity of the people were sufficiently respected. In their writings and conversation, the philosophers in antiquity asserted their independent dignity of reason, but they resigned their actions to the commands of law and custom. Viewing with a smile of pity and indulgence the various errors of the vulgar, they diligently practised the ceremonies of their fathers, devoutly frequented the temple of the gods, and sometimes condescending to act a part of the theatre of superstition, they concealed the sentiments of an atheist under the sacerdotal robes. Again, this is incredible what he's stating. He's essentially arguing that the emperors were essentially deists at best or atheists at worst, and that all of it was kind of a lip service to maintain some kind of stability or societal harmony. Again, I'm going to have to disagree with Gibbon here, because I think what he's fundamentally misunderstanding is that, the Romans were a very deeply religious and devout people, as I've covered in the bit I read earlier from Colon, John's Succession. They were deeply particularistic people, and especially in respect of their religion. And so when they allowed other gods to be worshipped, such as Cybele, the goddess of Anatolia, the Earth Mother, the cult of Isis from Egypt, and even Mithras from Iran. This is very much as a way of preserving a kind of stability by saying, fine, we'll allow these gods to be worshipped, but so long as you worship our own Roman gods, as one great pantheon, then that's fine. And this is a way the Romans can kind of get people to buy into the system. So there's a practical need to have this policy. It wasn't some, enlightened policy from, Hadrian or Marcus Aurelius reading Stoic philosophy. I mean, I agree that, Marcus Aurelius was certainly a Stoic. I mean, he did write the Meditations, but I think Gibbon is, I don't know, trying to read too much in Enlightenment contemporary thought into the empire. I have a comment from Richard Phillips. If you haven't read Gibbon's book on the Ottoman Empire, the chapter on Murad IV is hilarious and has much in common with modern day observations. Oh, I'm assuming that's a later volume of Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, because I know he does cover the fall of Constantinople. Carry on reading Gibbon. So, where was I? Viewing with a smile of pity and indulgence the various errors of the vulgar, they diligently practised the ceremonies of their fathers, devoutly frequented the temples of the gods, sometimes condescending to act as part of the theatre on superstition. I've already read this bit, sorry. Reasoners of such a temper were scarcely inclined to wrangle about their respective modes of faith or of worship. It was indifferent to them what shape the folly of the multitude might choose to assume, and they approached with the same inward contempt and the same external reverence the altars of the Libyan, the Olympian, or the Capitoline Jupiter. It's not easy to conceive from what motives the spirit of persecution could introduce itself into the Roman councils. The magistrates could not be actuated by a blind, though honest bigotry, since the magistrates were themselves philosophers, and the schools of Athens had given laws to the Senate. They could not be impelled by ambition or avarice, as the temporal and the ecclesiastical powers were united in the same hands. The pontiffs were chosen among the most illustrious of the senators, and the office of supreme pontiff was constantly exercised by the emperors themselves. They knew and valued the advantages of irreligion as it is connected with civil government. They encouraged the public festivals which humanized the manners of the people. They managed the arts of the divination as a convenient instrument of policy, and they respected as the firmest bond of society the useful persuasion that either in this or in a future life, the crime of perjury is most assuredly punished by the avenging gods. But whilst they acknowledged the general advantages of religion, they were convinced that the various modes of worship contributed alike to the same salutary purposes. And as in every country, the form of superstition, which had received the sanction of time and experience, was the best adapted to the climate and to its inhabitants. Avarice and taste very frequently despoiled the vanquished nations of the elegant statues of their gods and the rich ornaments of their temples, but in the exercise of the religion which they derived from their ancestors, they uniformly experienced the indulgence and even protection of the Roman conquerors. The province of Gaul seems, and indeed only seems, an exception to this universal tolerance. Under the specious pretext of abolishing human sacrifices, the emperors Tiberius and Claudius suppressed the dangerous power of the Druids, but the priests themselves, their gods and their altars, subsisted in peaceful obscurity to the final destruction of paganism. Yeah, and just to give some final commentary on that religious policy, it's important to note that the five good emperors themselves patronized a lot of the new gods that were coming into Rome. I mean, Antoninus Pius patronized the worship of the aforementioned Cybele, formalizing her cults and making the sacred ritual, the Torabolium, or the bull sacrifice, a public religious ceremony. If anybody who's watched the TV show Rome by HBO, there's a scene, I think it's in the first episode, where Attia of the Julii is praying for the safety of her son, Octavian, the future Augustus, on his trip to meet with Caesar, who's in Gaul. And there's actually a scene where you see her actually partaking in a Torabolium, where she's in this pit underneath the bull and its throat is cut, and she sort of showers in its blood. And then a priest or priestess reads the omen to her as good. It should also be noted that Antoninus Pius also patronized Mithras, erecting a temple at Ostia. It should also be noted, though, that there are elements where you could argue that the five good emperors were not exactly, shall we say, tolerant. I mean, their attitude on the Christians was quite persecutory. I mean, there's a famous letter between Trajan and his governor of Bithynia at Pontus, Pliny the Younger, where Pliny is reporting to Trajan about the obstinance of the Christians for not adopting Roman worship, and Trajan says, you're very right, Pliny. Yes, the Christians must observe our race. They must render unto Caesar. And then, of course, you've got the more obvious example of when Hadrian causes the Bar Kokhba revolt by building a temple of Jupiter in Jerusalem and insisting that the Jews worship Jupiter, and then he very brutally crushes that revolt and denies the Jews most of their rights. So, regardless of what you think of Hadrian for that action, you can hardly call that, an enlightened religious policy. And I think it's interesting that Gibbon doesn't bring up the Bar Kokhba revolt, and nor does he mention Trajan's attitude towards the Christians there. Again, as we know, Gibbon is the source of this idea that Christianity was responsible for the decline and fall of Rome. So I think he's very much giving into his biases there. But in terms of Gibbon's other commentary on their policies, Gibbon does praise Hadrian and the Antonines for their attempts to improve the lot of slaves in the empire, namely the abolishing the master's power of life and death over their slaves, which is now set to a magistrate. So now, if you want to kill your slave, you no longer can just do it arbitrarily. You have to go to a magistrate and justify a proper reason for executing your slave, and the magistrate can rule for or against you. Hadrian also abolishes the ergestula, or which are these slave workhouses or sweatshops. And there's also the construction of many famous public monuments, especially Trajan's, his Forum and Trajan's Column. Hadrian, who finished the temple of the Olympian Zeus at Athens. Of course, there's Hadrian's own villa he built at Tivoli, and also the Pantheon, which had been built originally by Marcus Agrippa, had burned down twice by this point, and Hadrian rebuilds it for the third time. So again, very much leaving a great architectural legacy. And there's just another reading I want to do from Gibbon, kind of giving his own comments on the succession, which I've talked about before. Okay. Nerva had scarcely accepted the purple from the assassins of Domitian before he discovered that his feeble age was unable to stem the torrent of public disorders, which had multiplied under the long tyranny of his predecessor. His mild disposition was respected by the good, but the degenerate Romans required a more vigorous character, whose justice should strike terror into the guilty. Though he had several relations, he fixed his choice on the stranger. He adopted Trajan, then about 40 years of age, and who commanded a powerful army in Lower Germany, and immediately, by decree of the Senate, declared him his colleague and successor in the empire. It is sincerely to be lamented that whilst we are fatigued with the disgustful relation of Nero's crimes and follies, we are reduced to collect the actions of Trajan from the glimmerings of a abridgment or the doubtful light of a panegyric. There remains, however, one panegyric far removed beyond the suspicion of flattery. Above 250 years after the death of Trajan, the Senate, in pouring out the customary acclamations on the accession of a new emperor, wished that he might surpass the felicity of Augustus and the virtue of Trajan. We may readily believe that the father of his country hesitated whether he ought to entrust the various and doubtful character of his kinsman Hadrian with sovereign power. In his last moments, the arts of the Empress Plotina either fixed the irresolution of Trajan, or boldly supposed a fictitious adoption, the truth of which he could not be safely disputed, and Hadrian was peaceably acknowledged as his lawful successor. Under his reign, as has been already mentioned, the empire flourished in peace and prosperity. He encouraged the arts, reformed the laws, asserted military discipline, and visited all the provinces in person. His vast and active genius was equally suited to the most enlarged views and the minute details of civil policy, but the ruling passions of his soul were curiosity and vanity. As they prevailed and as they were attracted by different objects, Hadrian was by turns an excellent prince, a ridiculous sophist, and a jealous tyrant. The general tenor of his conduct deserved praise for its equity and moderation. Yet in the final days of his reign, he put to death 4 consular senators, his personal enemies, and men who had been judged worthy of empire, and the tediousness of a painful illness rendered him, at last, peevish and cruel. The Senate doubted whether they should pronounce him as a god or a tyrant, and the honest decree to his memory were granted to the prayers of the pious Antoninus. Yes, that is one thing in fairness to Gibbon. He does address some of the arbitrariness. As he's mentioned, Hadrian It should also be noted that Trajan was also known to be rather arbitrary. Um, so, but when we get to Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius, they are much more they're much more just. Particularly, Antoninus Pius is given the title of Pius, Latin, the origin of our word pious, so saintly or peaceful. Continuing on, the caprice of Hadrian influenced his choice of a successor. After revolving in his mind several men of distinguished merit, whom he esteemed and hated, he adopted Aelius Verus, a gay and voluptuous nobleman, recommended by uncommon beauty to the lover of Antinous. But while Hadrian was delighting himself with his own applause and the acclamations of the soldiers, whose consent had been secured by an imminent donative, the new Caesar was ravished from his embraces by an untimely death. He left only one son. Hadrian commended the boy to the gratitude of the Antonines. He was adopted by Pius, and on the accession of Marcus, was invested with an equal share of sovereign power. Among the many vices of this younger Verus, he possessed one virtue, a dutiful reverence for his wiser colleague, to whom he willingly abandoned the ruder cares of empire. The philosophic emperor dissembled his follies, lamented his early death, and cast a decent veil over his memory. As soon as Hadrian's passion was either gratified or disappointed, he resolved to deserve the thanks of posterity. By placing the most exalted merit on the Roman throne, his discerning eye easily discovered a senator about 50 years of age, blameless in all the offices of life, and a youth of about 17, whose riper years opened the fair prospect of every virtue. The elder of these was declared the son and successor of Hadrian, on condition, however, that he himself should immediately adopt the younger. The two Antonines, for it is them that we are now speaking, governed the Roman world for 42 years, with the same invariable spirit of wisdom and virtue. Although Pius had two sons, he preferred the welfare of Rome to the interest of his family, gave his daughter Faustina in marriage to young Marcus, obtained from the Senate the tribunitian and proconsular powers, with a noble disdain, or rather ignorance or jealousy, associated him to all the labours of government. Marcus, on the other hand, revered the character of his benefactor, loved him as a parent, obeyed him as his sovereign, and after he was no more, regulated his own administration by the example and maxims of his predecessor. The united reigns are possibly the only period of history in which the happiness of a great people was the sole object of government. Titus Antoninus Pius had been justly denominated the second Numa. The same love of religion, justice, and peace was a distinguishing characteristic of both princes, but the situation of the latter opened a much larger field for the exercise of those virtues. Numa could only prevent a few neighbouring villages from plundering each other's harvests. Antoninus diffused order and tranquillity over the greatest parts of the earth. His reign is marked by the rare advantage of furnishing very few materials for history, which is indeed little more than the register of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind. In private life, he was an amiable as well as a good man. The native simplicity of his virtue was a stranger to the vanity or affectation, I should say, sorry. He enjoyed with moderation the conveniences of his fortune and the innocent pleasures of society, and the benevolence of his soul displayed itself in the cheery serenity of temper. The virtue of Marcus Aurelius Antoninus was of a severer and more laborious kind. It was the well-earned harvest of many a learned conference, of many patient lecture, and many a midnight lucubration. At the age of 12 years, he embraced the rigid system of the Stoics, which taught him to submit his body to his mind, his passions to his reason, to consider virtue as the only good, vice as the only evil, all things external as things indifferent. His meditations, composed in the tumult of a camp, are still extant, and he even condescended to give lessons of philosophy in a more public manner than was perhaps consistent with the modesty of a sage or the dignity of an emperor. But his life was the most noblest commentary on the precepts of Zeno. He was severe to himself, indulgent to the imperfections of others, just and beneficent to all mankind. He regretted that Avidius Cassius, who excited a rebellion in Syria, had disappointed him by voluntary death of the pleasure of converting an enemy into a friend, and he justified the sincerity of that sentiment by moderating the zeal of the Senate against the adherents of the traitor. War he detested as the disgrace and calamity of human nature, but when the necessity of a just defence called upon him to take up arms, he readily exposed his person to 8 winter campaigns on the frozen banks of the Danube, the severity of which was at last fatal to the weakness of his constitution. His memory was revered by a grateful posterity, and above a century after his death, many persons preserved the image of Marcus Antoninus among those of their household gods. If a man were called to fix the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would without hesitation name that which elapsed from the death of Domitian to the ascension of Commodus. The vast extent of the Roman Empire was governed by absolute power under the guidance of virtue and wisdom. The armies were restrained by the firm but gentle hand of 4 successive emperors, whose character and authority commanded involuntary respect. The forms of the civil administration were carefully preserved by Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and the Antonines, who delighted in the image of liberty and were pleased with considering themselves as the accountable ministers of the laws. Such princes deserved the honour of restoring the Republic had the Romans of their days been capable of enjoying a rational freedom. The labours of these monarchs were overpaid by the immense reward that inseparably waited on their success. By the honest pride of virtue and by the exquisite delight of beholding the general happiness of which they were authors, a just but melancholy reflection embittered, however, the noblest of human enjoyments. They must often have recollected the instability of a happiness which depends on the character of a single man. The fatal moment was perhaps approaching when some licentious youth or some jealous tyrant would abuse to the destruction that absolute power which they had exerted for the benefit of their people, their ideal restraints of the Senate and the laws might serve to display the virtues. Sorry, I lost my place. One moment. Hope so. But can never correct the vices of the emperor. The military force was a blind and irresistible instrument of oppression, and the corruption of Roman manners would always supply flatterers eager to applaud, and ministers prepared to serve the fear of the avarice, the lust, or the cruelty of their masters. The gloomy apprehensions had already been justified by the experience of the Romans. The annals of the emperors exhibit a strong and various picture of human nature, which we should vainly seek among the mixed and doubtful characters of modern history. In the conduct of those monarchs, we may trace the utmost lines of vice and virtue, the most exalted perfection, and the meanest degeneracy of our own species. The old golden age of Trajan and the Antonines had been preceded by the age of iron. It is almost superfluous to enumerate the unworthy successors of Augustus. Their unparalleled vices and the splendid theatre on which they were acted had saved them from oblivion. The dark unrelenting Tiberius, the furious Caligula, the feeble Claudius, the profligate and cruel Nero, the beastly Vitellius, and the timid, inhuman Domitian are condemned to everlasting infamy. During 80 years, Rome groaned beneath an unremitting tyranny, which exterminated the ancient families of the Republic and was fatal to almost every virtue and every talent that arose in that unhappy period. Yeah, and that's the end of that last bit I wanted to read on Gibbon. And so, last thing I really have to say is that there's a bit later where Gibbon then comments on the again the question of succession of Commodus, and he largely blamed this on Marcus Aurelius' own character, because there's been claims that his wife Faustina, who'd been the daughter of Antoninus Pius, was cuckolding him, and he was so enslaved to her will that he could not find an alternate heir to Commodus, because he couldn't dare, disinherit the son he had with Faustina. And I think that's a bit unfair. I mean, I've read around about Faustina, and this claim that she was whoring herself off isn't entirely consistent. So I suspect there may be some slander just to try and provide an excuse for why why Marcus didn't find an alternative heir to Commodus. But as I've said before, I think Marcus was in an impossible situation. I think the only amicable way this could have been resolved is if Commodus died, I don't know, some freak illness, and then Marcus would have no choice but to adopt someone. But alas, that was not the case. And a super chat by Richard Hughes for £20. Thanks for the excellent stream. Keep up the good work. Well, thank you so much, Richard Hughes. And now what I want to do is I want to turn to a work and a historian whose take on the 5 good emperors I actually find quite interesting, and at the time I actually thought it was mind-blowing, which is that of Arnold Toynbee in his study of history. The passage I'm about to read from Toynbee is something I've had on my mind for a long time, because he very much has a bit of a revisionist take, which I'll get into now. And he's very much repudiating Gibbon's kind of overly sort of plausitory review of the emperors there. This is quite a short section from the abridged study of history. So, when we previously considered the subject subject in connection with the growth of civilizations, we found that the degree of command over the human environment possessed by any given society at any stage in its history could be roughly measured in terms of geographical expansion. And we also found from a study of examples that geographical expansion was frequently accompanied by social disintegration. If this be so, it seems extremely improbable that this cause of the self-same breakdown and disintegration is to be found in the precisely opposite tendency, a tendency, that is to say, towards a decrease in command over the human environment, as measured by successful encroachment of alien human forces. Nevertheless, the view has been widely held that civilizations like primitive societies lose their lives as a result of successful assaults upon them on part of the external powers. And a classic exposition of this view is given by Edward Gibbon in the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. The theme is declared in the single sentence in which Gibbon sums up his story in retrospect. I've described the triumph of barbarism and religion, the Hellenic society embodied in a Roman Empire, which was at its zenith in the age of the Antonines, is represented as having been overthrown by a simultaneous assault from two alien enemies attacking on the two different fronts, the North European barbarians issuing out of the no man's land beyond the Danube and the Rhine, and the Christian Church emerging from the subjugated but never assimilated Oriental provinces. It never occurred to Gibbon that the age of the Antonines was not the summer, but the Indian summer of Hellenic history. The degree of his hallucination is portrayed by the very title of his great work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire! The author of a history that bears that name and that starts in the second century of the Christian era is surely beginning his narrative at a point that is very near the end of the actual story. For the intelligible field of historical study with which Gibbon is concerned is not the Roman Empire, but a Hellenic civilization, of whose far advanced disintegration the Roman Empire itself was a monumental symptom. When the whole story is taken into account, the rapid decline of the empire after the Antonine age is seen to be not at all surprising. On the contrary, it would have been surprising if the Roman Empire had endured, for this empire was already doomed before it was established. It was doomed because the establishment of the universal state was nothing but a rally which could delay, but not permanently arrest, the already irretrievable ruin of Hellenic society. If Gibbon had set himself to tell the longer story from its beginning, he would have found that the triumph of barbarism and religion was not the plot of the piece, but only an epilogue to it, not the cause of the breakdown, but only an inevitable accompaniment of a dissolution in which the long process of disintegration was bound to end. More than that, he would have found that the triumphant church and barbarians were, after all, not external powers, but were really children of the Hellenic household, who had been morally alienated from the dominant minority in the course of a time of troubles, which had intervened between the Periclean breakdown and the Augustan rally. In fact, if Gibbon had carried his inquest back to the true beginning of the tragedy, he would have had to return a different verdict. He would have to report that the Hellenic society was a suicide who had attempted, when in his life was already past saving, to avert the fatal consequences of his assault upon himself, and who eventually received a coup de grace from his own mishandled and alienated children at a time when the Augustan rally had already given place to a third-century relapse, and the patient was manifestly dying from the after-effects of his old self-inflicted wounds. So yeah, a completely damning indictment by Arnold Toynbee of Edward Gibbon. And just to try and give some more context, so in Toynbee's sort of model of the cycle of civilizations, you have four stages. You have genesis, or the births, the growths, or the rise of civilizations, which can then give way to a decline or breakdown. And what's interesting is there's several things can happen when a civilization enters breakdown, or what Toynbee terms as a time of troubles. It can avert the crisis and enter a period of growth again. So in the case of the Greco-Roman or Hellenic society, as Toynbee calls it, there was a period of breakdown after the Peloponnesian War, leading up to the time of Alexander the Great and Philip of Macedon. And then you have the Hellenistic era, this great explosion of Greek culture. So a second period of growth, before you encounter another breakdown during the latter years of the Republic. Looking at the Gracchi, the dictatorships of Sulla, and the social war and later civil wars of the Optimates and Populares, before having the Augustan rally and another period of growth. But what can also happen is, as you mentioned with the Augustan rally, is a civilization can get locked into what he calls as a universal state, where the entire civilization, rather than broken into a series of states or kingdoms, is unified in one totalizing empire, namely the Roman Empire, for the Greco-Roman peoples. And what a universal state does, the universal state isn't the apex of civilization. It is merely the freezing of time. It is locking the civilization in amber, preventing any further entropy or decline. And it's very much just regurgitating old forms. And again, Gibbon praising the Antonines for their love of, Stoic philosophy. Well, and him trying to read some comparison to the contemporary Enlightenment isn't really it was a bit of a weird comparison, because the Enlightenment was a contemporary philosophical movement at the time Gibbon was writing. It was in vogue. It wasn't, it wasn't about, it wasn't like everybody going about reading, ancient medieval philosophy or ancient Greek philosophy. It was an entirely thing unto itself. Whereas with the Antonines, they're not coming up with something new, because the universal state is incapable of innovating. It has to go back and regurgitate the philosophy of the past. So hence the classical philosophy of Athens, of Stoicism, or Epicureanism, or what have you. These are ultimately, you can almost say it's a kind of, you can almost say that the civilization at this point is like a cancer patient, and the universal state is some very late chemotherapy that's not proving very effective. And the other thing that can happen is the universal state can eventually break down, and you get what's called a disintegration, where the civilization completely ceases to exist, and you have the dual forces of the internal proletariat, in Rome's case the Christians, and the external proletariat, the Germanic barbarians, that come in and destroy the empire and then create a new civilization, or Western civilization, on its ashes. So again, a very strong revisionist take from Toynbee, one that I'm very sympathetic to, because I think we owe it to to history to have a proper understanding of things. And I'm not trying to take away any good things or positive aspects of the reign of the Nerva-Antonine dynasty. We have to recognize it for what it was. It was not the peak, as Toynbee says. It was the Indian summer of the of classical civilization. And there's one last author I want to read from for the stream this evening before I wrap up. This is from The Collapse of Complex Societies by Joseph Tainter. So Tainter is a more quantitative historian. So when he's looking at the collapse of civilizations, he's more looking at things like economics and more material factors. And so for him, he's mostly, when he's with Rome, he's looking at mostly the currency and financial aspects, which I think are certainly valid. Just getting the page up. Okay. Emperors upon accession were often faced with an insolvent government and rarely were able to accumulate reserves for emergencies. When extraordinary expenses arose, the supply of coinage was frequently insufficient. To counter this problem, Nero began in 64 AD a policy that subsequent emperors found increasingly irresistible. He debased the silver denarius, raising the content of base metal to 10%. He also reduced somewhat the size of both the denarius and the gold aureus. This proved no solution, for Vespasian, who increased the number of legions to 30, encountered a pressing need for money, and so both raised taxes and debased the currency further. Adding to the problem, Domitian increased the pay of legionaries to 300 denarii per year, while Nerva established a public system for the care of Italian orphans. The Emperor Trajan embarked on an ambitious and expensive program of military expansion. While successful in the field, the booty taken from the conquered lands apparently did not even cover the cost of his campaigns, and of that booty, more than one-third was distributed among the urban poor, at some 650 denarii per head. Consequently, the denarius, which had been restored under Domitian and Nerva to its Neronian standard, was devalued by 15% to a level of 79 to 88% purity. Trajan's successor Hadrian dropped the financially untenable policy of expansion and abandoned the new acquisitions of Mesopotamia and Assyria. At the same time, however, he instituted a public dole at Athens, gave largesse to the poor at 1,000 denarii per head, and incurred heavy costs in his travels and building programs. To economize in military costs from Hadrian's time on, army units were raised as often as possible from the locality where they would be stationed. Hadrian occasionally granted tax waivers, perhaps indicating that by his time, higher taxation would have created difficulties. The next emperor, Antoninus Pius, attempted to shrink the level of Hadrian's administration. He tried to reduce the number of government officials and even some of the imperial property in the states. Although he repeatedly gave largesse to the people of Rome, 800 denarii per head, Antoninus Pius left in the treasury at his death a substantial surplus, totaling 675 million denarii. This surplus proved short-lived. During the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the edifice of the empire began to crack. The two major crises confronted the empire while he held the throne. First, a devastating plague began in 165 or 166 AD, known as the Antonine Plague. It lasted about 15 years and caused significant loss of life, as much as 1/4 to 1/3 of the population in some areas. Secondly, wars with Germanic tribes kept the emperor in the field for much of his reign. The Roman Empire that thrived on the plunder of expansion and that had at least maintained stability when expansion ceased and revenues leveled off, found itself hard-pressed to deal with stress surges of this magnitude. The cost of Marcus Aurelius' barbarian wars exceeded the level that could be supported by the empire's normal income. One consequence, as might be expected, was the depletion of Antoninus Pius' surplus. Yet even with the surplus, Marcus Aurelius found his wars too expensive for revenues and was forced to finance the empire's efforts by conducting public auctions of imperial valuables. He also had to raise new taxes and debase the denarius to between 70 and 78% silver. Despite his difficulties, he still made donations to the soldiers and the poor. In addition to the problems of financing the barbarian wars, Marcus Aurelius faced a shortage of recruits for his army. Because of this, he was forced to settle the defeated Marcomanni within the borders of the empire on the condition that they furnish recruits. So again, the beginning of the beginning of the federati system, or the need to get these foreign tribal mercenaries in exchange for land. This is in some ways not surprising, for although population may have risen under the early Principate, by the 2nd century AD there was a shortage of free agricultural labour. Not only did this have consequences for agriculture, but also for the military, which depended on the peasant population for recruits. There are indications that these financial exigencies extended to more than foreign and military affairs. The cities of the empire had few resources of revenue, so selected officials were usually drawn from the local wealthy classes and were expected to personally to finance all or part of the duties of their offices. As these expenditures increased through time, the amounts paid by these magistrates rose. By the 2nd century AD, these duties grew to be so burdensome that candidates for office began to fall off. Commodus, who succeeded Marcus Aurelius, is of interest to the study, primarily for further debasement of the denarius. Under his rule, it dropped to as low as 67% silver. The death of Commodus marked the end of the Antonine dynasty. In the succession struggles that followed, Septimius Severus ultimately emerged, but with an uncertain hold on the throne. His securest position, he and his successors of the Severan dynasty courted the army. The resultant military costs strained finances. Septimius Severus increased the pay of troops to 400 denarii per year. His successor Caracalla raised it to 600, while by the end of the Severan dynasty, it stood at 750. The size of the military was also increased to 33 legions, nor were military costs the sole problem. Septimius Severus supplemented the Roman dole with the addition of oil to the list of free commodities. Mattingly has noted of this time, the expenses of government were steadily increasing out of proportion to any increase in receipts, and the state was moving readily in the direction of bankruptcy. So what we have there with Tainter is ultimately the reason the five good emperors reign was relatively stable is because they were able to buy the loyalty of the army by perpetually and the people by creating inflation by lowering the value of silver in the currency. This was to pay the army higher wages and also to provide dole, or essentially as a form of welfare, to buy the support of the people. So yes, this meant they were popular and were able to raise rule quite stably. This had a long-term problem of, because essentially the main argument being made by Tainter in the collapse of complex societies is that empires or civilizations eventually collapse due to what he calls the decline of diminishing returns, where the output of economic or financial resources diminishes over time to the point where the state has to start cannibalizing itself in order to perpetuate what it can. But as a result, it's like a death spiral, essentially, of diminishing resources. And as we can see, after the Antonines, we then have the Severan dynasty, where things get terminally worse, and then later with the crisis of the 3rd century, and then by the time Diocletian comes in, the currency is almost completely worthless, frankly. So though the Antonine emperors didn't start the practice of debasing the currency, they very much normalized it. and to that we have to hold them accountable. And so, in summary, I think these rulers were very noble, despite some of the arbitrariness, were very far-sighted, very talented, but ultimately, I almost see them again leaning back into this idea of Twine Beasts that they constituted the Indian summer. It's almost a bit like Atlas. These are a series of atlases holding up the Roman world from the from civilizational decline and entropy, and with them gone, things just couldn't be maintained as much as the old standards could be. I wonder what people's thoughts are. If people have got questions, now is your time to ask them. Yeah, it doesn't look like we're got any questions, so I'll wrap this stream up here. I hope everybody enjoyed this. In terms of future streams, I might be with Marcus Furious Pertinax tomorrow, finally doing the follow up to the Belisarius stream we did about 6 months ago. I'm hoping that will happen. If it does happen, it's going to look like it'll be much earlier. It'll be in the morning British time, so I get that might be a bit early for American watchers, but I'd rather have it happen and then people can watch it on later than it not happen. So I'll announce on X or Twitter if we're definitely doing that. And of course, the series on modern Iran will return next month once Hunger has returned from his travels. So again, thank you, Richard Hughes, for your super chat earlier, and thank you everybody for watching. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Good night.